My name is Jim Entz. I'm the coordinator of Chap, and I'm happy to present today Leslie Pelon as the Constitution Day speaker. She will be speaking on the Vice Presidency, a built-in constitutional crisis. And I would like to give just a brief moment to talk about Chap and its events, and then I'll introduce her. The words Chap actually mean Porterville College Cultural and Historical Awareness Program. It was organized in 2002 to enhance awareness on campus and in the community for important aspects of our culture to which students and community members might not have had previous exposure. So each year we have a theme that we decide upon, and in that theme we have events, we have lectures, we have various things that we encourage the faculty members to infuse that theme into their courses and to give students a chance to have an exposure to this theme. The theme we have for this year is the Anthropocene, and we have further events related to this. These events, all of them are free and open to the public, so there is no charge, so feel free for that. For students who are here, if you want extra credit, I'll have somebody when it comes time at the end of the lecture by the doorway with extra credit tickets where you can receive one for your attendance here, and that's a record of that. Really quickly, next speaker that we have will be actually in a couple of weeks. It's going to be October 6th. It will be on Thursday. We will have Jay Hargis speaking on his topic of We Are All Romans. There will be more of that coming up in our publicity, so look for that. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Leslie Pelon. She spent her childhood in the Bay Area until moving to Porterville in 2000. She attended Westfield, Bartlett, Porterville High School, and took classes at Porterville College. After graduating from Porterville High, she went to Brigham Young University, where she studied history and English literature. After 10 years in Utah and Maine, she returned to make her permanent home in Porterville with her husband and 2 children. She spent several years substitute teaching at Porterville High School while pursuing a master's in history from Southern New Hampshire University. Her thesis focused on women preachers of the Second Great Awakening. Since earning her master's, she has been teaching history classes at Porterville College, and now we're fortunate to have her speaking on this Constitution Day event. So, Leslie Pelon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for inviting me to speak today. I remember 20 years ago being a kid and coming to the very first Chap event in this actual theater, back when it was the Manzanar Project, and getting to see some survivors of the Manzanar experience perform. And it's actually really surreal to be here as a presenter today. I hope you guys understand how fortunate our little college and community are to have these Chap events. This is 20 years of Chap, and Richard Osborne, Robert Simpkins, and now Jim have been making this possible. So let's give a round of applause and 20 more years of Chap, right? So let's be honest, if people think about the role of the vice president, the first thing that comes to mind is usually the idea of presidential succession. In our modern world, we take it for granted that if something were to happen to our president, be it illness, assassination, or even removal from office, the vice president will take on the position. The system seems obvious, simple, and elegant. But problem solved, next. Yet the story I will tell you today Sorry, the lights are throwing me off. Today came through almost 200 years of constitutional crises and compromise. So let's begin that story. As we tell the story of the vice presidency, it is essential that we make sure we understand what the Constitution actually says about the job. We find the role of the vice presidency in a few places in the Constitution. First and foremost, we find it in Article 1, Section 3. Now, Article 1 actually discusses the roles of the legislative branch. And there in Article 1, Section 3, it says, "The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided." So if the Senate is tied. "The Senate shall choose their other officers and also a president pro tem in the absence of the vice president, or when he shall be exercising the office of President of the United States." So really, we don't even need the vice president there to be president of the Senate. If he doesn't show up, they can elect their own person. So the first job of the vice president is to preside over the Senate. But again, he doesn't have to be there. And the only time the vice president even gets a vote is if the Senate is actually tied. There have been times under our current administration, for example, with Kamala Harris, where the power of the vice president to break ties in the Senate has been very, very important, and vice presidents have had that active role. But those times are rare. And even then, most vice presidents have found spending time in the Senate to be more frustrating than anything else. Second place where we see the vice presidency within the Constitution is in Article 2. And this is where we learn how the original writers, the framers of the Constitution, thought the vice president should be chosen. And we will talk about that more in a minute because drama. But there's a brief important statement also included that in the case of removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve upon the vice president. And that's it. According to the original Constitution, the vice president has nothing to do unless the Senate is tied or the president is dead. There is no obligation for the president to consult with or inform the vice president of anything. And when George Washington became the first president with John Adams as vice president, that's exactly what happened. George Washington set a precedent that has been imitated by many of his successors. The precedent of keeping the vice president on the sidelines. And John Adams became the first vice president to vocally hate the job. As John said in a letter to his wife Abigail, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or imagination conceived. And as I can do neither evil nor good, I must be borne away by others and meet the common fate." Now, it may seem odd that Washington would choose to sideline the man who was supposed to be his potential successor, his number two. But when we take a closer look at how the first three vice presidents, including John Adams, were elected, it makes a lot more sense. Today, presidential candidates and their parties work together to choose a running mate, and the president and vice presidential candidates become a package deal. Initially, however, that's not the case. You see, the framers of the Constitution had some major concerns about the position of the vice president. As we learn when we read the Federalist Papers, which are those documents that explain more than anything what our constitutional framers were thinking, we realize that some of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention believed there was no reason for a vice president, or even that the Senate should elect their own president and that person should serve as vice president. It becomes very clear that the framers were worried more about someone unqualified or corrupt being given the position than any sort of problem with presidential succession. So they came up with an obvious, and yet to us, and in hindsight, clearly flawed idea that the vice president would be whichever presidential candidate came in second place. Let me repeat that. Whoever came in second place in a presidential election would become the vice president. I'm hoping all of you can see where this is headed. Now, at the time, this approach made perfect sense. The framers of the Constitution hated the idea of political parties and hoped that the United States would never become divided by them. This was also a time when candidates did not run for office themselves. Instead, their friends would campaign for and nominate them, while the candidate themselves stayed humbly on the sidelines, only reluctantly accepting the position if elected. If this is the system you use for campaigns, then it makes sense you would not be as concerned about the idea of a second place finisher being vice president. Yet, as you can imagine, this causes many problems. Think about it. If this was our policy today, currently our president would be Joe Biden and his vice president would be Donald Trump. Or even better, think back to 2016, Donald Trump as president with Hillary Clinton as vice president. Now, as entertaining as that might have been, I mean, me personally, had that happened, I'd have been investing in microwave popcorn because we all would have been partying hard with that. But I think we can all see that a pairing like that is not particularly productive or healthy for the nation. While the relationship between George Washington and John Adams was not nearly as toxic as either of the examples I've given, they still were not an effective team. And Adams spent his 8 years in the vice presidency on the sidelines. To quote Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, John Adams doesn't have a real job anyway. So it's not until Adams becomes president himself that the problems with the system really become obvious. John Adams won the election, and Thomas Jefferson came in second. On paper, you would think this was a great team up. The two had been friends and colleagues for over 20 years. Surely, if any two political rivals were destined to make a functional president and vice presidential team, it was these two men. Yeah, it didn't quite work out that way. As the leaders of the first two political parties in United States history, the Jefferson and Adams friendship and working relationship imploded. Jefferson funded anti-Adams newspapers, and the accusations were so vile, Adams supported a series of what was known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, limiting freedom of speech and the press, a move that tarnished Adams' reputation and his presidential legacy. While many missteps and personality flaws contributed to John Adams' defeat in the election of 1800, the painful reality of having an old friend turned enemy in his administration contributed to John Adams making history as the first one-term president in the United States. After his own painfully close election in 1800, in which the House of Representatives had to make the final call between him and Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson wasted little time working to change the rules of the vice presidential election. He was not going to allow what happened to John Adams to happen to him. No, sir. A new system, a better system, had to be found. And so in 1804, the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. The 12th Amendment clarifies several issues that had come up with the original Constitution's electoral process, but the main change would be that rather than the vice president being whoever came in second place, our current system of running mates was instituted. No longer would presidents be forced into partnerships with political opponents. Now they would, theoretically at least, have a say in their running mates and avoid having a political enemy being forced on them. By the Electoral College, at least. As we will see, plenty of future presidents are still going to have to deal with running mates being foisted on them by party leadership. With the sticky issue of how to elect a vice president finally figured out, it seemed the job was bound to fade into obscurity. Like most of the men who held the office, little was heard from most vice presidents for almost 40 years. It wasn't until April 1841 that once again the issue of the vice presidency would be at the center of a constitutional crisis that shook the nation. The election of 1840 is known for many things, especially campaign gimmicks. Even today, many people have heard and remember the phrase "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," which was the campaign slogan for William Henry Harrison, general of the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his running mate John Tyler. We also get the term booze from this particular election because an alcohol producer by the last name Booze decided to make whiskey in log cabin-shaped bottles as a campaign gimmick. The newly powerful Whig Party was thrilled to finally have gained the presidency, and William Henry Harrison was a popular enigma. Seen as a president who would allow for party leadership, like the power-hungry Henry Clay, to dictate policy while Harrison kissed babies, waved at crowds, and signed on the dotted line. If the Whig Party had such low expectations for their actual presidential candidate, one can only imagine the sort of dismissive attitude they had towards the new vice president, John Tyler. And yet, after only 1 month in office, the worst happened. For the first time in United States history, a president had died while in office. Whether he was brought low, as traditionally said, because he gave an hour and 45-minute inauguration address in the rain, or because the White House had their well tapped into sewerage, as more modern historians claim, William Henry Harrison had died after serving a record low of only 31 days in office. Now the cabinet was faced with the problem of informing the vice president of the president's passing. John Tyler had very little intention of being an active participant in the government and had left on the afternoon of inauguration to return to his home in Southern Virginia, over 300 miles away. At the time of Harrison's death, Tyler had no idea how close he was to inheriting the highest office in the land. Secretary of State Daniel Webster sent his son Fletcher and a White House clerk to deliver a letter from the cabinet informing John Tyler that Harrison was dead. Arriving before dawn on April 5th, 1841, the two young men arrived at Tyler's home and delivered the fateful news. And yet, the letter that Tyler received did not greet him as the new president. It didn't even urge him to hurry back to Washington so that they could figure out what to do. Instead, the letter was addressed to Mr. John Tyler, Vice President of the United States, and assured him that the cabinet had all preparations and operations of government well in hand. What was going on? This was no coup attempt or some way to secretly get around the Constitution. Instead, this was a sign of a serious constitutional debate about what the framers had meant. And as most intricate debates about the Constitution do, this one centered on punctuation and word choice. Let's remind ourselves about what the Constitution says about this. Again, Article 2 of the Constitution says, in case of the removal of the president from office, or his death, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president, and such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed or a new president shall be elected. So when we look at this with our own modern understanding and looking back at the precedent, it seems very obvious, and we assume that president dies or is removed from office, the vice president obviously becomes the new president, both in responsibility and title. We also take it for granted that the new president will finish the old president's term with no need for an off-cycle election. But to the politicians of 1841, this was not an obvious interpretation. Many including former President John Quincy Adams, who was then serving as a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, and cabinet member Daniel Webster, who was probably kicking himself for turning down being vice president to William Henry Harrison, were both believed strongly that the vice president should remain the vice president and acting as the president. They argued that the Constitution was phrased in such a way that it was clearly intended that only the duties and responsibilities would go to the vice president, not the title. They wanted him to act the manager without giving him the promotion or the pay raise. These same men argued that Tyler should only hold on to those duties until a special election could be called to elect a new president and vice president. John Quincy and his friends began referring to John Tyler as his accidency. Tyler had other ideas. He believed that the Constitution intended for a vice president to take on both the duties and the title of president. He was going to work his wage, act his wage. And he was not going to let the cabinet or Congress deny him his new role. After finding out about Harrison's death, Tyler wasted little time, leaving his dying wife, Letitia, who, by the way, less than a year later would become the first lady to die while her husband was in office, and their 7 young children behind. John left for Washington. He was there within 24 hours. Upon arrival in Washington, Tyler immediately called together Harrison's old cabinet and began discussing Harrison's funeral and other precedent-setting moments that they would be overseeing. This had never happened before. How do we honor a president who's died in office? We don't want it to look too royal. We're a democracy. Who should march where? Does the Senate march before the House? Members of the cabinet who had already gotten used to Harrison's egalitarian approach to the presidency, where he allowed each member of cabinet to have an equal vote with himself, were shocked when Tyler immediately asserted control and implemented his own policies and procedures. He clearly informed them that he was president, and if they did not like his style of governance, they could resign. While none of them took him up on the offer, it was clear that the relationship between Tyler and his new cabinet would be a tense one. Tyler also set another precedent upon his return to Washington. There was a discussion within the cabinet about if the new president needed to take a new oath of office in order to officially take on the role of president. Tyler argued that his oath as vice president should be sufficient, as it promised basically the same thing. But the cabinet encouraged him to retake the oath as presidency. Whether he caved as a peacekeeping measure or to ensure that the "your accidency" crowd could not complain, Tyler took the oath. Every vice president to ascend to the presidency has followed his example, even though there is still no constitutional requirement to do so. With his new cabinet behind him and the oath of office under his belt, John Tyler was ready to face Congress in a special session. Tyler faced his critics and defended his decision to take over the presidency. After his address, a resolution was put forward to officially recognize John Tyler as President of the United States. While the resolution passed by a pretty wide margin, Democrat John McKinnon of New York made a motion to alter the text of the resolution, replacing the word president with vice president, now exercising the office of the President of the United States. Well, that's a mouthful. The motion failed, mostly because people probably didn't want to have to write that at the bottom of every letter they addressed to the president. But many politicians refused to call Tyler Mr. President, instead referring to him as acting president for the rest of his term. Tyler was petty and outraged by this practice, and for the rest of his term refused, unopened, any letter that did not address him as President of the United States. Since John Quincy Adams refused to write any letter to him addressing him as President of the United States, the poor aides had to keep running back and forth for all eternity, bouncing these letters back and forth. While Tyler's presidency has not gone down as one of the most effective or celebrated, in fact, he seems to be a footnote, his navigation of this first vacancy in the presidency set expectations that would guide the men who followed him. And I'm going to do now what most history textbooks do and skip over Millard Fillmore, inheriting the vice presidency after Zachary Taylor died in office. While Fillmore's vice presidency and presidency is important, mostly because of the way he mishandled the sectional crisis leading up to the Civil War, the only truly distinguishing thing about him in regards to the vice presidency is that he's the first of only a very few who have actively pursued the job of being vice president. Most politicians have seen this job as a place where political ambitions go to die. Fillmore was the first to see its potential as an opportunity to benefit his home state and political cronies. And so we skip ahead to the election of 1864 and the unlikely marriage of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. As a nation, we have lifted Abraham Lincoln to such an elevated place in our national pantheon that we often forget that during his lifetime, he was not as universally adored. He faced, in fact, and as Lincoln prepared for his re-election campaign in 1864, his odds of winning a second term seemed slim. He faced opposition from Northern Democrats who wanted to end the Civil War even if it meant letting the South leave or bringing them back with slavery still intact. They had even recruited one of his own generals, George McClellan, to head their ticket and run against the president. Even from within his own Republican Party, Lincoln faced such dissent that he was forced to split off. And when he ran for his second term, he actually ran under a new party, the National Union Party, because the Republicans refused to nominate him. As Lincoln and his supporters looked around, they knew that if they wanted to win, they needed to find the right vice presidential candidate to round out the ticket, a term that we often hear today when discussing vice presidential picks. At the time, Andrew Johnson seemed like a pretty solid choice, and he was being celebrated as a hero for the Union. Johnson was a self-educated upstart from the Southern politician who, at the beginning of the Civil War, was serving as senator from Tennessee. Forever loyal to the Union and bitterly opposed to the Southern aristocrats he thought were destroying his home state, Johnson refused to resign his Senate seat when Tennessee voted to secede. He was the only senator from a Confederate state to remain loyal to the Union. A loyal Southerner, a Democrat, a man admired across the North for his fidelity to the nation, Johnson seemed like the ideal running mate as Lincoln worked to win a war and an election. And while it is difficult to say how impactful Johnson's name was to the ticket, as a series of events, including major victories and the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, ended up gaining Lincoln more support, it is clear that Johnson did not hurt Lincoln in any way, shape, or form. Lincoln even won Johnson's home state of Tennessee. As the two men took office in March 1864, the war was drawing to a close. The 13th Amendment had just been ratified, and everything seemed to be coming up roses. For 20 days, all seemed well. And then, on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The next day, Lincoln died, and Andrew Johnson became the president. Few turning points in United States history have inspired as many what-ifs as Lincoln's assassination and the subsequent presidency of Andrew Johnson. Would Lincoln have been as successful in creating a more amicable and lasting peace between the newly reunited North and South? Would he have navigated the treacherous waters of Reconstruction more effectively than the politicians he left behind? Would he still be as deified in our modern America as he is today? Well, we'll never know. What we do know is that Lincoln's choice of Andrew Johnson for vice president changed history. Because the Andrew Johnson, who was loyal to the Union and willing to work with Republicans and for Black equality when it would punish the Confederacy, was not the Andrew Johnson who stepped into Lincoln's place. I could and have given 45-minute presentations on Andrew Johnson's presidential failures and his culpability in the epic failure that was Reconstruction. Suffice it to say, Johnson's racism and Southern sympathies came out and clashed with Republican leadership. Johnson's clashes with Lincoln's cabinet became so hostile that he attempted to fire them all. When Congress told him he couldn't, even passing a law forcing him to keep them, he decided to fire them anyway and fought back. This led to a thoroughly mature standoff between himself and the Secretary of War, where Secretary of War Stanton barricaded himself in his office and refused to come out like an angry 10-year-old. For the following week, the whole Capitol was forced to watch poor, dejected General Grant march back and forth between the War Office and the White House, begging these men to please stop using him as a mediator, sending hate mail to each other, and just come to the table and work together. In the end, Andrew Johnson, because of this, would become the first U.S. president to be impeached. Now, as a reminder, and I see some of my former students out there, so I hope you will, when a president is impeached, does that mean they are immediately removed from office? No. Louder with more feeling. No, okay? No, impeachment is basically being put on trial, right? So Andrew Johnson is the first president to become impeached, and he is the closest anyone has ever come to actually being removed from office. He remained president by a single vote, and for the rest of his presidency was pretty much a lame duck. Johnson is the supreme example of how our current process for electing vice presidents, while an improvement on the original, still has its problems. Like Lincoln, most presidential campaigns see the vice presidency as a piece of political theater or capital. They appoint individuals who round out or diversify the ticket, and yet only a single heartbeat separates that person from the highest office in our government. And Johnson's example makes it clear how much can depend on who that person is. Of course, even when presidential candidates care about choosing a good election partner, party politics can get in the way. This was the case with James Garfield and Chester Arthur. Garfield was a modest, no-nonsense politician who was beloved for his integrity and strong stand against corruption. Arthur was a machine hack from New York who had been removed from his only official position because he was taking bribes. And yet Arthur had the ear of the party bosses, and Garfield was given no choice but to accept Arthur as a running mate. Few presidents have clashed so spectacularly and publicly as Garfield with Arthur. So that it was so bad and so public that when the delusional Charles Guiteau shot Garfield and claimed he'd done it so that Arthur would appoint him minister to Paris, much of the country actually believed that Arthur was complicit in the assassination. While it quickly became obvious that Charles Guiteau was actually clinically insane and delusional, the fear and the belief that that Arthur was complicit in Garfield's assassination continued with him throughout his presidency and the rest of his days. His presidency was plagued with accusations, and he was seen as a usurper. After the machine politics and scandal surrounding the assassination of James Garfield, hey, I would a great deal rather be anything, say, a professor of history than... Teddy? That's rude. That's just hurtful. Here I was going to spend all this time talking about how you are one of the few vice presidential success stories in our nation's history. You're the only accidental president who was actually on a presidential trajectory. McKinley's assassination probably just moved up the timetable a decade or two. You oversaw government reforms, environmental protections, and took on some of the major monopolies of your day. I was going to spend a bunch of time singing your praises, and you go and say something like that. Rude. You know what? Just for that, I'm going to lump you in with Woodrow Wilson's stroke. So there. Say a professor of history. Anyway, now that we've skipped over Teddy, and we've made it to the 1910s, the nation has navigated its way through 5 presidential deaths in office. Harrison and Taylor of disease, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley by assassination. And yet there is still no official constitutional answer to the problem of presidential succession. The idea that the vice president becomes the president was still based on John Tyler's precedent. and the question of who succeeds if both president and vice president was completely academic. And then there remained the matter of presidential disability. What did the Constitution mean when it said a president could be removed if unable to discharge his duties? Who would decide that? And what process would allow for that to be put in action? This question would become imperative during the final years of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Woodrow Wilson had helped the nation navigate the First World War and worked to negotiate a peace with Europe. He was on the cusp of achieving his lifelong goal of helping organize a League of Nations to prevent an international crisis from getting out of hand once again. Yet, as he prepared to canvass the nation, building support for the United States to join the League, Wilson had what historians believe was a massive stroke. For several months, Wilson was unable to speak, sign his name, or fulfill any other of his duties as president. And yet he remained the head of government. How? The answer is his wife, Edith. With the help of Wilson's doctor, Edith was able to hide the president's condition from Congress, the vice president, and even most of the cabinet. Behind the scenes for several months, Edith did the job for Woodrow Wilson without anyone knowing. After he recovered, though, never completely returning to full health, the truth of what had happened came out. Congress and the nation were horrified. How was this possible? And yet, without any official constitutional framework or policy, Edith had technically not done anything wrong. One would think that such a scandal and potential disaster would prompt the country to push for clearer rules about presidential incapacitation. But it would take another 40 years and 3 more deaths in office before that happened. While Woodrow Wilson did not die in office, his successor did. Warren Harding was the perfect president for the Roaring '20s, popular, fun-loving, and scandalous. His choice of Silent Cal Coolidge seemed an odd one, and yet they seemed to work together well enough. Really, the best story to come out of the Harding-Coolidge succession surrounds the events of Calvin Coolidge being sworn in as president. Coolidge was the 6th vice president to receive the fateful news that he was now president. And like five of the others, he had to be tracked down. I think it's important to point out, we're in the 1920s, and of the 6 vice presidents who've become president, only one of them was in Washington, D.C. when it happened. All the others were like, oh, I'm vice president. I'm just going to go home now. Okay. And the only reason Johnson was even there is because if he went back to Tennessee, he probably would have been shot. So, obviously, vice presidents don't feel very important. Coolidge was visiting his family in Vermont, and at the time, they had no working phone or even electricity. After being woken up and informed of his new position, Coolidge was shocked and, in his New England Puritan manner, returned upstairs to pray. The message sent to him stressed the importance of him being sworn in as quickly as possible. Coolidge's father was a notary and justice of the peace, and so at 2:30 in the morning, the family gathered in the kitchen as Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as President of the United States by his own father. While the story of his father swearing in his son as president is admittedly adorable and made for amazing headlines, there was concern it was not legally binding. And so, Coolidge was privately sworn in again once he returned to Washington to make sure that no one could question the legality or legitimacy of his presidency. Again, because there was no official, clear constitutional rule, a potential crisis over leadership emerged. The next series of events surround FDR. Most famously, FDR has been our longest serving president, elected to a historic and, since the passing of new amendments, the only opportunity to be elected to 4 separate presidencies. When he was being elected to his final term, it was very clear that the man was dying. And so one would think that as he entered that election, he would have thought very carefully about who he was choosing to obviously succeed him. And yet it seems that once again, party politics, more than the personalities or the potential leadership qualities of the people involved, played a hand in choosing his vice president. And so Harry Truman, the senator from Missouri, was chosen to be FDR's final vice president. Now, fine, FDR didn't spend a lot of time choosing Truman, but at least he included him in all these major decisions. I mean, the war is ending. We have to figure out how to deal with Germany. Who knows what Stalin's thinking at this point, let alone that funny little project that's happening down in New Mexico building atomic bombs. We need to include the vice president because obviously, if you're dying, your successor should probably know what's happening. But FDR does none of these things. Truman is, like many of his predecessors, pushed to the sidelines and not informed of anything. He's not even truly clear on how ill Roosevelt is or how close he is to becoming the president. And so when he gets that fateful call, which unlike the others were all the other men were informed by official decree, Truman's first call was from Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's wife. And his response to her was, "Eleanor, what can we as a nation do for you?" And she responded, "No, Harry. The real question is, what can we as a nation do for you now?" She knew more than Harry Truman did what he was in for. Truman, much like Teddy, is one of our few success stories when it comes to these accidental presidents. We were lucky to have him as a president, and he managed to negotiate a lot of these early Cold War moments. But that was not because anyone could have seen that coming. On paper, Truman was not the obvious choice. And so once again, here we are. No official transfer of power. We're still unclear on how the rules are supposed to go. And we fast forward now to 1963. The last time that we have lost a president while in office. Once again, John F. Kennedy, when choosing his vice presidential candidate, was looking for someone to round out the ticket. John F. Kennedy was an educated, highbrow, wealthy, fancy New England Democrat, and they knew they needed someone from the South, someone a little more rough, someone you could have a beer with to round out his ticket. So they reached down and they grabbed Lyndon Johnson from the Senate. And if anyone's rough around the edges, it was Lyndon B. Johnson. Unfortunately, Johnson couldn't actually bring the South into the fold, and Kennedy wins without him. So as Kennedy is gearing up for re-election, he heads down to Dallas with his current vice president to try and gear up support. And Johnson is really trying to win over Kennedy. Let me do this again. Don't fire me. As far as we can tell, Kennedy really didn't want to keep Johnson on the ticket. No one really respected him in the Kennedy White House. But all that changed. Because what happened in Dallas that day? Kennedy was assassinated. And the nation rallied around this family and this handsome young president who had just died, and then rallied around his successor. And somehow, for some reason, whether it was because Kennedy was so popular, whether it was because we were in a Cold War, it finally became obvious we need to have a set system for this. And so finally, all of these years later, after all of these constitutional crises, we get the 25th Amendment. And this is where we actually outline the process for presidential succession. This is where we understand that it goes vice president, and then how it goes through after the vice president, and in what situation, and actually what it means a little more clearly if a president is disabled and unable to complete his duties. And yet even there, within that vice presidential and in that 25th Amendment, there are holes. Today, when a president even goes under anesthesia for a short period of time, they enact the 25th Amendment. For example, I believe a few months ago, President Biden went in for a routine colonoscopy. They have to go under for that. And so for that brief window, he turned over the reins of government to Kamala Harris. And that has become practice. However, that is not actually in the 25th Amendment. That is just something that has now, by precedent, come into play. I hope that as we've talked about this, you've begun to realize that while we've come a long way in determining how a vice president is chosen and what their role is, we still have a problem. When choosing vice presidential candidates, when choosing their running mates, the question still seems to center more around rounding out a ticket, bringing in more votes. This is how you end up with situations of odd mixes. For those of us who were around, I don't think any of us will forget the McCain-Pelon debacle. And for those of you who weren't around, go look up SNL because they had all sorts of fodder for that. And but we have to realize when we are voting for these candidates, when we are paying attention to who these presidents are choosing, these presidential candidates are choosing for their vice presidents, those are the people who are a heartbeat away. We've been very lucky recently. It has been an unprecedentedly long time since we have lost a president in office and had to do this sort of enacting. We've come closer when it comes to impeachment in the recent years. But eventually, inevitably, that luck will run out. And we will have this moment. So I encourage you, we're in a midterm right now, and as my necklace says, always vote. But when you're considering presidential elections, when you're considering who these candidates are, when you're looking and watching, pay attention, not only to who the presidential candidate is, but that vice presidential candidate as well. Because over and over in our history, a moment has turned on a dime. When a person who was never supposed to be in that office and sometimes didn't even want it, became the president. Thank you. Oh, I guess I'm supposed to ask for questions. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned Roosevelt's vice president, and you remind me of Wallace, his vice president.
Yes.
And how during the Democratic National Convention he was excluded to be the vice president.
Yes. Wallace was excluded. He was seen as too. That was one of the things that was going into play when determining that final vice presidential candidate. Wallace was excluded because the rest of the Democrats saw him as too extreme. He flirted a little bit too hard with the Soviets, and they knew we were going into a potential Cold War, and they didn't quite trust him. So that's why Wallace was ditched for Truman. Yeah, definitely. So an important thing to watch as well. Yes.
Are we ever without a president? Let's say a president dies. Is there no president until the vice president takes the oath of office? Or is it like monarchy where there's never not a monarch?
So technically it immediately does devolve. The taking the oath of office is still a precedent kind of thing, not actually constitutionally mandated.
But we're never without a president.
We are never without a president. The 25th Amendment goes into effect immediately. Now, before the 25th Amendment, there was some debate about that particular nuance, but that's one of the reasons that we have that amendment today. Anything else? Yeah.
We're still evolving. Right now, what does it look like you as a professor? What do you see right now on our horizon? What would be the next step in the way we do this? What's being spoken? What's being said?
So that honestly, as a historian, I'm 5 years behind. I'm kind of the internet explorer of this particular discussion. But from what some of the debate that's been going on is that some of this is probably going to change less at a constitutional level and more within the individual parties themselves, and the structure in which they nominate these candidates. So rather than it being made in back rooms and private deals, some sort of election process within the primary and at the convention that's more public. Currently, those things are happening behind closed doors and opening those things up. Yep, no problem. Going once, going twice. Oh.
So the vice president doesn't, the office of vice president doesn't actually have any real duties or any official duties besides just that he'll take office if president, for example, the president.
Well, and if the Senate is tied, they do operate in the Senate. In fact, specifically in the whole battle between Garfield and Chester Arthur, there was a point where Chester Arthur refused to leave the Senate because as long as he was there, he, as president of the Senate, kind of controlled what came to the floor, and so he was able to keep any of Garfield's appointees from being put up for nomination because he was petty like that. And today, you know, Kamala Harris spends most of her time in the Senate because currently our Senate is deadlocked. So passing, you know, acting as Senate and breaking those ties is the major role. Also, kind of again, precedent-wise, the vice president tends to be a part of the diplomatic corps. They tend to kind of help out with that a lot. You'll have seen a quote, a couple of them mentioned, you know, earthquakes and third world dictators' funerals. They tend to represent our country in those situations diplomatically. Yes?
You see the role, potentially the role of the vice president changing now because of social media and everything else? Because if you get somebody that's really aware, I see that with the media, the couple, not this potential for the, you know, to have been one again, but if they get a vice president that's more social media, they'll have a lot of influence by actually having to vote. I mean, that's where I always saw that they had the most, some of these first ladies have been really, they're not vice president, but they have more influence in the nation by being actively socially.
Yeah, by being able to have those active face. And again, that currently is going to go very much between presidents and their vice presidents and their own personality in their relationship. For instance, you know, Obama and Biden. Obama included Biden. He kind of utilized Biden as a, you know, at least for my generation, the Uncle Joe figure, you know, allowed him to do some of the more like goofy things that as president he didn't feel comfortable with. But then you see, you know, Clinton and Gore, they had a very different dynamic as well. So that is definitely more of how these individuals interact with each other and their own personalities and management styles. Whether you have a president who's more willing to allow their vice president to go off and do those things.
In the amendment that says, in the event the president dies or is unable to serve, how unable to serve must the president be before you're actually president as opposed to having power? Because Kamala Harris is not America's first female president just because she held the power while he was undergoing the colonoscopy.
No.
So how unable does he have to be?
And that is one of those remaining gray areas. There's been several times where that's been a debate. We learned later that was a conversation happening in the Reagan White House as it began to become obvious that his Alzheimer's was starting to kick in. There have been other times that's been a conversation. No one's officially pulled that particular plug yet. I think it's going to be one of those things where we're not going to know till it happens. I wish someone had done it with Wilson, even though I love the fact that Edith Wilson ran the country for a hot minute. Like, that's a little scary. So, in the back, I saw your hand.
This is more of a fun question. I was wondering, who's your favorite president and why?
I feel much safer answering my least favorite president. But no, my favorite president, and honestly, it's a really silly reason, but my favorite president is John Adams, and it has everything to do with the fact I have a major girl crush on his wife. And so, like, by extension, it's kind of like splashback. I like him because she's amazing. But when it comes to like most effective, and as I'm beginning to learn more and everything, I actually, and he may not have been the most effective president, I really love Jimmy Carter. He's just good people, and can't say that actually about a lot of these guys, even the good ones. So
You can tell us about the worst one too if you want.
I have hot hate for Andrew Jackson, and if you want to learn more about that, take my History 117 class. So I think we're probably good, right, Joe?
Thank you.
Awesome.